Hi, I'm Phil Noble, and welcome to Envision, South Carolina. We're here at the College of Charleston with Dr. Ray Greenberg from MUSC, sort of the personification of world-class, globally connected. So welcome to Envision.
Well, thank you, Phil. It's good to be here.
We usually start out talking about where people came from, their background. You unfortunately are from North Carolina, right?
It's a cross I have to bear, I guess,
I know,
from your perspective. Yeah, I grew up in Chapel Hill. My father was on the faculty at the University of North Carolina. So I grew up in that little island of liberalism in the midst of a very conservative state. But it was a very idyllic childhood, growing up almost on the campus of the University of North Carolina.
Were you interested in medicine from early on? How'd you get the bug, so to speak?
You know, it's interesting. I don't think I really got interested in medicine until I got to college. And I was a chemistry major, and virtually everybody that was taking classes with me was pre-med. And it was kind of like osmosis. Their interest generated my interest. I got into doing research early on as an undergraduate. And from there decided that medicine was a place with a tremendous amount of opportunity.
And you graduated from medical school in North Carolina?
I went across to the dark side, as they would say in Chapel Hill. I went to medical school at Duke, and I graduated from there, and then did a little tour of duty in the north at Harvard School of Public Health, and was at Children's Hospital in Boston, and then came back to Chapel Hill where I got a PhD.
Public health at Harvard's like the best public health school in the country, right, or the world?
Well, it's hard to know exactly how you rank schools, but Harvard, Johns Hopkins, University of North Carolina, University of Michigan, those are all top-tier schools. And of course, the one that we created at Emory now is amongst them.
And then you went to Emory. Talk about that. And you were the boy dean of Emory?
Well, I went to Emory in 1983. It was my first job, and I was on the faculty of the medical school initially, taking over running a big cancer research program. It was funded by the National Cancer Institute in Washington, and it was the mechanism by which we collect cancer statistics in this country. One of the centers in the country was in Atlanta, so we registered information on every cancer patient that was diagnosed in the city of Atlanta. That generated opportunities for doing all sorts of research. So a main focus of my initial career was cancer research, particularly looking at differences between African Americans and Caucasians with respect to risk of developing certain cancers and then the prognosis once they get the cancer. From there, I early on became...
Let me interrupt you. Just, how big is that disparity between African Americans and whites?
It varies very much by type of cancer. So, take for example prostate cancer, a very common illness in older men of both races, but I think about 70% more common in African American men than in Caucasian men. And we really don't know exactly why that discrepancy exists. Certain cancers in women are more common among African American women than cervical cancer is a good example. So. On the other hand, there are cancers that are more common among whites than there are among African Americans. So it varies from type of cancer to other type of cancer.
And again, we're digressing, but in South Carolina, given the racial makeup of the state, is there a particular cancer that we have disproportionately here in South Carolina?
That's a great question. There are a number of cancers that we have in excess here, partly because of the demographics of our state. We have very high rates of esophageal cancer, the tube that connects our mouth to our stomach. Very high rates of cancer there, particularly among the African American population, and we don't really know why that is. There are probably dietary factors involved. There could be other environmental exposures that we just haven't figured out. We know that in general, people, historically, people who've gotten those kinds of cancers have been high rates of drinking and smoking, but that isn't necessarily true in the African American population. So we still have a lot of very fundamental issues to better understand when it comes to cancer risk.
From Emory to MUSC, right?
Right. So at Emory, I got into administrative work. I became a department chairman at the tender age of 32 in the School of Medicine. And then 3 years later, they decided to create a School of Public Health. And after a national search, I was selected to be the dean of that brand new school. And did that for 5 years, and then came to Charleston as the provost of the medical university. And then 5 years later, when Jim Edwards stepped down from the presidency, there again was a national search, and I ended up being selected to succeed him.
The national search has always found the guy down the hall.
Well, you want to make sure the guy down the hall really can compete with the best people.
Of course. Talk a little bit about your first sort of consciousness about South Carolina and our uniqueness and our culture and how we're different. And I mean, sort of what did you think about South Carolina being in North Carolina?
Well, my earliest exposure to South Carolina was as a kid. I can remember family vacations where my father loved to go to the beach, and so we would drive to North Myrtle Beach is where we used to vacation. And I can't remember the names of the motels that we used to stay at, the motor inns.
They're all gone.
They're all gone now. They're all replaced by high-rise condominiums and very elaborate hotels. But it was very much a family experience, eating calabash seafood. Right. That was part of growing up, and so that was my real first exposure to South Carolina.
When you travel around and meet people from different places and you tell them you're from South Carolina, what's their reaction?
You know, it's interesting. I think it's changed. Of course, the circles where I interact with are the professional circles in medicine and the research community. And I think when I first chose to come to South Carolina, which was 1995, I think people had sort of a questioning look, sort of wanted to know why. Today, now almost 20 years later, it's very different. People are aware that there are interesting things going on here. Charleston as a place is much more on the national consciousness than it was 20 years ago, as a highly desirable place to live. So I think now it's more envy when I go out and meet with colleagues elsewhere, whereas 20 years ago it was, why would he want to go there?
Right. Interesting. You know, the theme of what we're talking about is world-class and globally connected, and I think clearly there are lots of aspects of MUSC that are that way, that can claim that. And talk a little bit about the path of MUSC. And I mean, my first recollection was when Jonas Salk first came here as sort of a world-class guy. And talk a little bit about that progression from being just another medical school to being sort of what it is today.
Right. Actually, it was Albert Sabin that came.
Sabin, that's right. I knew it was one of the vaccines.
It was one of the polio guys.
Yeah, one of the polio guys.
But, you know, I think it's a little unfair for me to talk about the older history of the medical university because I wasn't here. And so what I know is mostly through talking with others, from reading about it. It's really secondhand. But I think it was a pretty provincial institution, which really defined itself, its mission as training physicians and healthcare providers for the state of South Carolina. It really did not see itself in the broader context of a research university, a place that was really contributing to the development of new knowledge, whether that's how to better take care of patients or understanding the science behind human illness and disease. So I think the transformation probably dates back to when Jim Edwards came as the president of the medical university. That was 1982. He immediately was coming from being the Secretary of Energy in the Reagan administration, and of course before that had been governor of the state of South Carolina. So what Jim brought, having been at the seats of power nationally and internationally, was really a bigger vision that we could be something a great deal more. And he always talked about wanting to be world class. Sometimes I'm not sure Jim had exactly in mind what that meant, but he knew that we wanted to attract the best people and we wanted to compete with the best. And I think that's something that just culturally didn't exist at the institution prior to that. Of course, he was president for 17 and a half years.
That's a long time.
It's a very long time in this business. And what that provided is a tremendous amount of stability over a long period of time of growth and opportunity. And then I was fortunate to arrive towards the end of his tenure to work with him and learn from him for about 4 or 5 years, and then succeed him. So I think while the changes may seem more dramatic in the last 10, 15 years, probably the real origins go back probably 15 years before that.
Yeah. When people think about MUSC and its place in South Carolina's history, one of the things that most often comes up, obviously, is the hospital strike in, what was that,
69.
69. Is there any residual consciousness of that? I mean, it was such a riveting event for not only Charleston, but the state and black-white relations. Is there residual good or bad still today from that?
Without question, in the community, I believe that there still is a residual from that. I have experience meeting with a lot of leaders of the African American community over issues around employees and how employees have opportunities for advancement, how they're treated, and so forth. And I can tell you that it is still very much in the consciousness of at least the generation that lived through it. Whether the younger generation who wasn't around at the time really has any sense of it or not, I don't know. But I think the more senior community leaders, many of them really arrived on the scene at the time. Senator Robert Ford, who has been in the state Senate now for quite some time, what brought him to Charleston was the strike and his involvement in the labor movement. So there is very much, I think, residual of that, and probably it'll be another generation or so before we really get past that. And I think there are still legacies of segregation and really the disadvantage that African Americans have suffered in the South generally and in South Carolina for a long time still pervade what we see in terms of the education system today, what we see in terms of health care today. The disparities in health status between the African American population and the Caucasian population are really traced primarily back to social roots, economic and educational.
Let's sort of talk a little bit more about that, about the sort of overall condition of health care in South Carolina and the disparities and what we need to do to overcome it. I mean, you've often said that it's MUSC, its primary role is health care in South Carolina. How have you sort of identified those core issues that you're going after, and then what have you done to make a difference in those?
Right. Well, first of all, it's what have we done is really a collective issue. There are lots of people involved, but I'd like to talk about some stories about, we think the problems are so big. We think, first of all, they're insurmountable. They're unchangeable. They've been there for decades, if not centuries, and therefore there's no hope of addressing them. I think that's the first myth. The second myth is that even if they're changeable, one person can't make that much difference. And I really want to give you a story that I think speaks very much to the difference one person can make. The state created a so-called endowed chairs program. It's almost a decade ago now. And the idea was to recruit into South Carolina some of the best minds in the country that would help drive our economy forward. One of the people we ended up attracting to South Carolina at the Medical University is a fellow by the name of Dr. Robert Adams. He came to us actually from Georgia. He's a stroke specialist, and at the time, South Carolina had the highest death rates from stroke in the world.
Really?
Certainly in the
United
world.
States.
Yes.
And what was this time period you're talking about?
This is
late
more
90s?
than about a late 90s, early part of the century. And Dr. Adams, what he had done is set up a network where the stroke specialists at the academic institution would be available through telemedicine. They could be connected to rural emergency departments so that when a patient came in with a stroke, they could immediately get connected to the specialist who could help the local doctor figure out what tests need to be done, and most importantly, get initiated definitive treatment as quickly as possible, because with a stroke it's really a race against time. The longer it takes to remove the clot, if it's a clot-type stroke, the more brain tissue is lost to the illness. And so you want to get that treatment started very quickly the first place the patient shows up. So this telemedicine network that Dr. Adams has basically single-handedly assembled in South Carolina has the medical university at its core, the so-called hub, and the spokes go out to 15 hospitals, particularly smaller rural hospitals in the I-95 corridor. If you do a map by county of South Carolina and you look at the death rates from stroke or, quite frankly, heart disease or cancer, what really lights up is our rural counties, partly because of the demographics, but partly also probably because of access to care and other issues. And so Dr. Adams, now this program has been in place for 4 or 5 years. Over 3,000 consultations have taken place. Over 500 patients have gotten state-of-the-art treatment who wouldn't have gotten it before. And now the death rate from stroke, we're still barely in the top 10, but that's a dramatic change in less than a decade from the number 3 cause of death, and certainly one of our leading problems, health problems in the state. So I do believe technology is not the answer to all of our problems, but it can be an important connection. It removes, fundamentally, telemedicine removes geography as a barrier to getting the best care possible. It should never matter today whether you live in Charleston or you live in Kingstree or Moncks Corner or Lake City. You should have access to the best specialists that are available because the technology can bridge the geography, and that, I think, is a huge promise, particularly to our rural parts of our state.
How far are we from being sort of at the maximum of providing that telemedicine service?
We're far ways away from being at the maximum.
20%, 30%? I know it's hard
to talk percentages, but the positive spin on this is I've had conversations with some of our legislative leaders, particularly in the House Ways and Means Committee in this legislative cycle, and I think for the first time I'm very optimistic that they will appropriate money that will help expand the telemedicine effort in this state, just as other states have done it. Arkansas is a great example of a state that has made a significant investment, and it's really had a dramatic impact on improving the health of their population.
Is it because technology is so cheap? I mean, is that the driver of why it can be so effective?
Well, technology has improved dramatically. What images and so forth that we can send now just over the internet has dramatically changed in the last 5 or 10 years.
That's the bandwidth issue, right? I mean,
it's bandwidth. It's getting high-speed bandwidth into the rural areas. A lot of them, like the introduction of so much technology, it's really we've written some fairly large federal grants to the FCC to get funding to try to. The FCC's been putting money into this because obviously they want everybody to get connected. They see this as a great tool of empowerment. The Department of Agriculture has been very interested in supporting efforts to reach out to the rural communities and bring them connectivity to high-speed computing. But that has been an important aspect of just being able to get the technology into some of the smaller communities in our state.
If you had to sort of identify 2 or 3 areas that you think are world-class at MUSC, what are those 2 or 3 areas that are really as good as they are anywhere in the world?
Right. Well, the first place I would start is the Department of Psychiatry.
Really?
Yeah, they rank the National Institutes of Health, which is the main federal funder of research and is very competitive to get funding from. We rank, the last rankings I saw, 6th in the country in terms of psychiatry departments.
That's because we need it so bad in this state.
Well, one of my heroes is James Lewis Pettigrew, who 150 years ago said, when South Carolina was threatening to secede, that we're too small to be a republic, but too large to be an insane asylum. And I don't think much has changed, unfortunately.
That is the defining definition of our beloved state in my mind. Anyway, go ahead.
But there are many areas of expertise in psychiatry within our department. A very important one nationally is post-traumatic stress disorder, as we have so many veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq who've had really horrendous experiences. We now have far more veterans committing suicide than are actually killed.
Right, I saw that,
in
stunning
combat.
number.
It really is a staggering problem, and of course many that come out of rural communities don't have access to psychiatrists in them. So again, through telemedicine, we're partnering with the Veterans Administration, we're really helping reach out to the veteran population. Drug and alcohol programs, that's another place where we're national leaders. The program here was ranked 8th in the country. Tremendous recognition for the work going on there.
Are we in South Carolina, is our drug and alcohol problem worse than, I mean, are we in the top 10 or the bottom 20? I mean, where are we in terms of how big a problem that is for us in South Carolina?
Well, we certainly have problems related to motor vehicle accidents, and driving under the influence is a major contributor to that problem. We have certainly high rates of drug violence, domestic violence, which is probably also aggravated by drug and alcohol problems. So, I don't know the statistics offhand, but certainly some of the social problems that one associates with high levels of use of drugs and alcohol, certainly we see in abundance, unfortunately, in our communities.
So psychiatry, drug and alcohols, what's the third you would say?
Well, I'd almost lump those together. Another area that we have tremendous expertise is in stem cell research, particularly around stem cell research related to the heart, the developing heart, and with the hope that we can develop cures for some cardiac problems, whether it's after a heart attack regenerating heart muscle, or it's the pacemaker of the heart, trying to generate a biological pacemaker rather than have to insert a mechanical pacemaker when people have rhythm disorders. And another area I would say is in the neurosciences. We've been ranked again in NIH in the top 10 in neuroscience research. I think we were as high as number 2 or 3 at one time, above Johns Hopkins. So there are plenty of other areas, but those are ones that I think are truly at the highest levels of any institution in the United States, or quite frankly, the world.
You talked about stem cell stuff. Obviously, stem cell has been a very controversial issue in terms of the politics of the thing. Have you seen the research or your work limited or inhibited or obstructed because of stem cell issues in this state?
Right. So the ethical issue and then became the political issue was about embryonic stem cells, and that's taking stem cells, growing them from embryo tissue. That's not what we're doing today.
I got it. Embryonic is not your
right.
focus.
It's not what we work on. What some really important advances happened about 3 or 4 years ago, where investigators, I think initially in Japan, showed that you could take skin biopsy, take skin cells, grow them in a petri dish, and figure out which are the genetic levers to turn to make them into very primitive cells that have the potential of becoming any kind of cell, what we call technically a pluropotential cell. The name doesn't matter. What it means is it's sort of deprogrammed into something that can then be reprogrammed into any other kind of cell in the body. So what's really remarkable about this, of course, is we have abundance of skin cells. It's easy to get them, to harvest them. You can get them from an adult. You don't have to have banked cells from an embryo. And it's the person's own cells that you're going to be retransplanting back, so you avoid all the problems of rejection and having to put people on drugs that suppress their immune system. So I think that really is going to be the pathway to stem cell research in the future. It's not about embryos anymore. It's about getting adult stem cells and figuring out how to manipulate them to change them into other kinds of cells.
Fascinating stuff. You'd love just to go wander around over there and stop people in the hall and say, "Tell me what you do."
Sometimes I do that.
Yeah, I think that'd be fascinating. Let's talk about South Carolina in general, and what you see as both our assets and our barriers to becoming sort of world class in this globally connected world. What are your sort of 2 or 3 thoughts on assets and liabilities?
Well, in terms of assets, it's hard to not start with the physical environment of this state. It's certainly one of the most beautiful places I've ever lived. When we're out recruiting people to come to the medical university, there's no question in my mind that we attract people because of the quality of life here. When I left Atlanta, I loved Atlanta, but there was no question in my mind that the quality of my life was going to improve when I moved to South Carolina.
You mean you didn't like 3-hour commutes every day?
I lived 4 miles from the Emory University campus, and it took me 45 minutes to get into work. And this was this was 20 years ago. It's even worse today, I'm sure. Yeah. So quality of life, I think, is really important, and the physical environment, I think, is a major part of that. I think the history of, I'm a little biased living in Charleston, but what an amazing place to live, where to come onto the College of Charleston campus for this interview, you're walking down cobblestones of history, right. and you get a sense of what a vibrant community this has been for centuries, and that makes you optimistic about the future. What holds us back in this state, I think we could all probably make the same list. I think it's surprising to me in some respects that we still have the regional conflicts in the state that have long historical roots, kind of the upstate and the Midlands and the Lowcountry all sort of trying to compete with each other, when in fact the real competition it's not just outside the state in North Carolina or Georgia, it's in India and in China and other places. So I think what we really need to do is create a culture of people bridging the gaps between our regions and partnering together. The other kind of cultural thing that I first experienced when I moved here, Leighton McCurdy, then the dean of the medical school, described to me as the crab trap or crab pot phenomenon, which is when you're out crabbing and you get a bunch of crabs, one of the kind of more aggressive innovators is going to try to climb its way up the sides of the pot, but before you know it, one of the other crabs just pulls them down into the pot. I think there's kind of an anti-elitist attitude in this state. There's kind of maybe a bit of jealousy about success, and it
sort of about redneck heritage there, if you will.
Well, I don't know. Whatever we want to call it, I think it's a sense of being extraordinary is not a good thing. Being exceptional is not a good thing, and in fact, we should celebrate our successes and the successes of South Carolinians. We should all take great pride in them. Amazing people in this state, and you look at some of the adversity that some people have overcome, and it just makes you feel good about who we are as a people.
Yeah. Right now, everybody's talking about affordable health care, the Obamacare, et cetera. Describe for me South Carolina if we don't have Obamacare, and if we do.
Well, first of all, it's the law of the land. The Supreme Court has.
No, I understand, but I mean, in terms of they're fighting about it, whether we accept the money.
So the big fight that's going on at the moment, which is a huge issue, and I think it is not really registered in the public consciousness to the extent it needs to, has to do with whether we accept the Medicaid expansion money. Right. So it takes a minute to sort of give you the background on this. Part of the whole deal of the healthcare reform legislation was obviously to expand coverage. Part of the way that was going to be done was to expand the eligibility for Medicaid from now the national benchmark is 100% of the poverty level. So what that means, I'll get the numbers probably a little bit off, but for a family of 4, that's an income of around, I think, $16,000, $18,000 a year. I mean, it's a pretty subsistence income. Expand the eligibility up to 138%, so about a 40% increase, which would put it around $28,000 a year for a family of 4. It's pretty hard to buy health insurance if your total income to your family is only $28,000 a year, and most commercial insurance is going to cost $7,000 or $8,000 a year in the typical marketplace. Part of the way we were going to pay for that expansion was to cut payments that hospitals are presently getting today for taking care of uninsured patients. Because we're going to have more patients who are insured, we would need less money for taking care of uninsured patients. So the American Hospital Association agreed early on to endorse healthcare reform because while they were going to lose money from one pocket, they were going to gain it in another pocket, and things were going to balance out. That was the plan. What changed things is when the Supreme Court ruled that the healthcare reform is constitutional, but the states can opt in to whether they decide to do the Medicaid expansion or not. What happened was the blue states pretty quickly said, well, we're going to do it, and most of the red states said, well, we're not going to do it. We're against Obamacare. We're against anything that the administration is a proponent of. And so what this has done, there are now about, I think, less than 10 states that are continuing to refuse the money. Some that governors were refusing it, like Governor Brewer in Arizona. I think that the governor of Ohio just decided that they were going to take the money. Right. It's an amazing financial deal for the state. It's over the next 7 years, it would be $11.5 billion would be infused into the state of South Carolina, would create a tremendous amount of jobs. If we had a company that was going to come into South Carolina and spend $11.5 billion into our economy, we'd all be running to sign them up and thinking of all the great state benefits we could think of to attract them here. I can't think of any company that's had that kind of single company that's had that kind of economic impact over 7 years. But instead, because it's federal money and it's related to federal law, there's been great resistance to taking the money. So this is a huge issue now for the hospitals because they've paid the penalty. The money has been removed from one pocket, and now the money that was supposed to be put in the other pocket is in jeopardy. For our institution alone, that means over the next 7 years about $250 million that won't come in. That's enough to put us out of business.
Is it really?
You know,
I mean,
we're a $1.2 billion a year operation.
1.2, so that's basically a quarter of your budget.
Right, but our bottom line last year was about $7 million. So if we had to deal with an average of about a $40 to $50 million problem,
you got a real problem.
That would be a huge problem. If it didn't put us out of business, it would certainly change the way we do business. It would mean significant downsizing of services that we presently lose money on. And of real concern to people who have private health insurance is, who makes up the gap? We lose money, we and every other hospital in the United States lose money on everything we do except for commercial insurance. They are the only place that hospitals make any money. And so what this will do is now put even more pressure on the rates that we charge to commercial insurance to make up the difference of what's no longer coming from the state. And that's ultimately going to drive up the cost of health care for companies and private citizens in South Carolina. So the net effect, I think once we have the data, it's just hard to imagine that we won't, within a few years, sign up for Medicaid. I'm told when the original Medicaid program came out, South Carolina was one of the last states to sign on to that. So we're reliving our history here, and I respect the political leadership doing what they think is the right thing to do. But in the final analysis, I think we've got to look at in aggregate, not ideology, but what advances the economics and the quality of life for South Carolinians. And to me, that will involve taking the federal resource just as most states are going to be doing soon.
I mean, when you talk about the dimensions of putting things like MUSC essentially putting you out of business, and the hospitals have basically said, it's a 10-to-1 match and we'll pay the one, right? So I mean, it's and we're going to pay it anyway in taxes. So I mean, I think your friend and mine, James L. Pettigrew, was right. If the people in South Carolina, in their wisdom, decided that they were going to make you King Ray the First, and they picked you
We
up.
don't believe in monarchs in this state.
I understand, but
we don't even believe in strong governors in this state.
I'm not sure we believe in democracy in this state in some instances. But if you were king, and what would you have us do? What would you, 2 or 3 things you would do to change South Carolina in the way that you think we should be to become sort of world class?
I think I try to encourage some of what's going on right now in the state, which I think is incredibly exciting. If you look at some of the emerging technology companies, the ones I'm most familiar with are in Charleston, because I interact with them the most. But it's certainly true in the upstate and in the Midlands as well. We have a booming technology economy in this state. And part of that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the quality of life. When you look at the so-called creative class and where they can locate, quality of life is a huge decisive factor, and we have some wonderful places to live in this state. And so I think we can attract great talent into South Carolina. And it's a different kind of recruitment than, say, recruiting a Boeing or a BMW here. The Department of Commerce strategies, which historically have been about recruiting big manufacturing companies, what we've seen, that strategy worked incredibly well for about 30 years as we started moving some of the manufacturers from the Northeast and other places where there were unions and it was expensive labor. It was basically, we could do things at the same quality or better quality here with a cheaper workforce. Right. Well, what we discovered is there are cheaper workforces than there are in South Carolina, and that business has gone away. What won't go away is business related to the knowledge and talent of people that are here. It's really the so-called knowledge-based industries. And I look at a young startup company, People Matter, that's here in Charleston. Nate DePore, the CEO of it, very impressive young guy who really, he could be anywhere in the world. He could be in Silicon Valley. In fact, he is part-time in Silicon Valley. But he's headquartered here, and he sees his future and development in Charleston because he sees tremendous growth opportunities. He talks about they have the Silicon Valley out there. We should be the Silicon Harbor here, and I think that's a great vision. Obviously, we feel like we can play a key role in the biomedical piece of technology development. But whether it's in information technology or biomedical, I think there's huge opportunity here, and it really, in the final analysis, really comes down to people growing our own talent and encouraging them to stay in South Carolina rather than to migrate to Atlanta or Charlotte or Washington or wherever else they might go, to have the job opportunities here and to nurture and develop them. Any
Advice you'd give to that young guy thinking about leaving South Carolina? What would you tell him? Why should he stay here? Why should he, or at least go away and come back? That's what I always tell kids: go away, but come back.
Right. I think going away is a good thing because it exposes you, whether it's for a year to go study abroad or you go and work for a period of time somewhere else. I think it's maturing to be exposed to another culture and another place. I think you learn so much about what's different about people and also what's common about people when you're traveling and in other settings. But we want them to come back here, and I think what will draw people back here, what has drawn people back here for generations, is family, is the ties, it's the social ties, it's the beautiful environment and setting, and what needs to attract them back is the opportunities. I think in the final analysis, if we don't have the kinds of jobs that will be of interest and will compete on the same salary scale, it's going to be very hard to recruit the best and brightest back here. When I look at, I had the opportunity to chair the board of the Governor's School for Science and Mathematics for several years. It's an amazing talent pool that comes to that school, and it's a very diverse pool. It's from all parts in Hartsville.
Right.
And of course there's the art school, the Governor's School for the Arts in Greenville. And that school I don't know as well, but it's also an amazing set of students. And of course we have the Academic Magnet School here in Charleston, which is a nationally ranked school. We have amazingly talented young people in the state. I think the challenge for us is to create enough opportunity that they will see their future in South Carolina. And I'm very optimistic about that. The changes I've seen in the 18 years I've been here have been dramatic And I think this is a place that has a very, very bright future ahead of it.
You are optimistic.
I am.
Very optimistic.
I am.
MUSC's done some really interesting things. I was reading about the doctor who's sort of doing barefoot brain surgery, to use the Chinese model, in Tanzania. And what is the global vision of MUSC?
Key part of our strategic plan at the university is to expand our global outreach. It basically is recognizing the fact that the world is now a small community and that we have connectedness to people and cultures and systems around the world. So we're trying to do that in all aspects of our activity. Say, for example, in the educational front, as we look now, so many of the pharmaceutical clinical trials are being offshored to India and probably soon China and the rest of Asia. Yet they don't really have the workforce there that's been trained in the scientific underpinnings of doing good clinical trials research. So we've taken our Master of Science in Clinical Research degree program, which was only offered on our campus, really targeted to our own folks to train them. We're now taking that to India, to Singapore, and soon I hope to China, where there will be huge important audiences for us to get that MUSC education out to. At the same time, from a research point of view, if you look at partnerships that we can develop, say, in China, just the sheer numbers of patients that you have with sometimes uncommon conditions that would be very difficult to study here, it becomes much easier to do it in a country where numbers are not a problem.
Million, there are a lot of those.
There are a lot of them. So that's a great opportunity from a research point of view. And then from a service point of view, we have lots of outreach. You mentioned a program in Africa. We've partnered in Ghana and Tanzania, a number of countries, where we're trying to build capacity. For years there have been medical missions where people from the United States have gone and provided services for some period of time, often a month, and then they disappear, and all they've done is sort of
help a few kids.
Help a few people. They haven't created the capacity to change within the culture. And I think what we're recognizing today is that we should be focusing on training the people within the country to better be able to serve the needs of their population, so that when we're not there, the services can be continued and many, many more people can be reached.
One of the things that I think has made a big difference is your health services initiative that spans the varying regions and so on. Talk about the genesis of that and how that's essentially sort of knitting the regions of our state together.
Right. So I talked about the problem of competitiveness within our state. To me, the great opportunity is to really collaborate, to build bridges with other institutions. So we at the Medical University have been working very hard to try to do that over the last decade. And let me just cite a few examples of that. One is that we merged our pharmacy school with the pharmacy school at the University of South Carolina about 8 or 9 years ago. The reason, both of those schools were actually pretty good pharmacy schools. They were in U.S. News and World Report ranked, I think we were around 25th, and USC was close to it. But if you looked at what are the characteristics of the top 10 schools, they were about twice the size of our school in numbers of faculty, amount of research grants, number of students, most of the parameters that people measure to measure quality. And there was no way that we were going to get into that league on our own. But if you took the assets of the University of South Carolina and the assets of the Medical University and you put them together, and especially you looked at the complementarity of, we have great strength in the clinical area, they had some great strength because I have a chemistry department in medicinal chemistry, we can really create a whole that is much bigger than the sum of the parts. And we've done that. We've merged the schools, and the last NIH rankings that I saw, we were 14th. We're not in the top 10 yet.
No, but that's a quantum leap.
We have moved from around 40th to the top 15 or so in the country. Another example is with Clemson. We don't have an engineering school, obviously, as a freestanding academic health center. Clemson has a very good engineering school, and a big focus has been biomedical engineering. We've worked with them for many years, but the problem is if the engineers are all up in Clemson and the clinicians are all down in Charleston, even with technology, the great ideas, the friction that needs to take place of passing one good idea to another is not going to happen on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis. And so what we created is a new structure where there are Clemson engineers, faculty members, and graduate students full-time on the MUSC campus, working side by side with clinicians. And that has taken the collaboration to a whole new, incredibly exciting level. So, and the third collaboration is the one that you alluded to. Health Sciences South Carolina is the union of the 3 research universities with the 4 biggest teaching hospitals in the state. It's the only state in the country where this has been attempted, much less pulled off. And what we've done a number of initiatives to try to improve our state's competitiveness, whether it's in research funding or in the clinical area. And we're in the process of creating a data warehouse that has information from all of the 4 major hospital systems. This would be a great attractiveness to the pharmaceutical industry, who would love to do clinical trials where they had access to very large populations very quickly and could look at what's happening in those populations. So this I think is something that we're just beginning to realize the power that's going to come from getting people to work together. So while we have, Clemson and USC will always compete on the football field. Right. They probably will always compete for the best students. Right. But there are ways that each of the 3 research universities can work together to our mutual advantage, where we all benefit. And I think these are just a few of the examples that I hope we'll see many more of in the future.
That was the effort you talked about with the 4 hospitals and the 3 research institutions. How much of that is sort of the standardization, digitization of medical records? Are we better, worse? I mean, that always seemed to me to be a real low-hanging fruit to reap a lot of benefits.
Right, and this is a great example because of the 4 hospital systems, I think they're on 3 different commercial vendors of electronic health records. But it turns out that once you define the information you want to share, extracting the information and moving it, the technical part of it is actually quite simple. And we've done that here in Charleston. All the hospitals are participating in an information exchange so that a patient who shows up in any of the emergency departments, the doctor, if they've been seen in any other healthcare system in town, and there's a lot of crossover between where patients are seen, they have immediate access to that information so that the doc, instead of having to have records manually pulled and faxed over, which is the state of the art in most of the country, and was in Charleston until a few years ago, now we can, that information can be almost instantaneously available to the clinician. And what it does is save unnecessary tests, particularly important unnecessary X-ray studies like CTs of the belly, which involve a lot of radiation exposure. So it's not just the cost of it, it's the potential harm that could be done from extra studies. Fewer consultations, fewer admissions, much better care, faster flow through the emergency rooms. I mean, this is the way it ought to be. I mean, it's frustrating to me that this is an innovative program. You would think it ought to be that way. If you look at other industries like the financial services industry, they've been sharing information between their one bank and another bank. It doesn't matter what ATM you go to, they can get information to know what's in your account. Obviously, the banks want to protect that information just as the healthcare providers want to protect the information, but we found ways to share information that benefits you as the consumer, and that's ultimately, I think, where the rubber hits the road here in terms of healthcare technology. It's how do we empower the consumer to be more informed about their health status and what they can do to improve their health status.
But in terms of sort of looking at the overall health picture in South Carolina, is that medical records one of the sort of most promising low-hanging fruit with the greatest dividends, or is that just sort of glitzy and talked about a lot?
Well, I have a certain bias because we're spending a lot of time working on these issues, and my bias is that it is very important. It will help us bridge the almost unconscionable gaps in care that exist within our healthcare delivery system today. The lack of information, if you're seen in an emergency room, and then the follow-up is going to be done if you have a primary care provider, and that has to happen within a week, sometimes 2 weeks, and there is no way that that doctor will, within that time frame, have received information from the emergency room about exactly what the diagnosis was and what was done for you and what the follow-up should be. I mean, how can we possibly consider that acceptable care? I mean, I think if the public really...
Smartphone.
Yeah, I mean, and smartphones, I think, are gonna ultimately be the way. I think what's gonna happen in this country is, in the same way that the house call disappeared, was replaced essentially by the office visit. Today's office visit, within a relatively short period of time, is gonna be, I don't want to say replaced, that may be extreme, but it's going to become much less important, because the ways that information are transmitted from patients and devices that are monitoring patients to their doctors, they won't have to be in a physical place. That information will be transmitted spontaneously. It is, I mean, I get a little excited about this because it will fundamentally change the way care can be delivered, and it will be a much more seamless, continuous process than the episodic ways that today we depend upon care to be delivered.
The continuum of care becomes sort of your update in your iPhone in your pocket.
A real continuum, not an artificial continuum of a few points along a line. It really becomes the line itself, and that.
That's exciting.
When you're monitoring biological processes, they do change minute to minute often, and so having much more extensive information will allow the doctor and the patient together to make much more informed decisions. Envision South Carolina, world-class, globally connected.
Americans and whites.
It varies very much by type of cancer. So, take for example prostate cancer. A very common illness in older men of both races, but I think about 70% more common in African American men than in Caucasian men. And we really don't know exactly why that discrepancy exists. Certain cancers in women are more common among African American women than cervical cancer is a good example. So on the other hand, there are cancers that are more common among whites than there are among African Americans. So it varies from type of cancer to other type of cancer.
And again, we're digressing, but in South Carolina, given the racial makeup of the state, is there a particular cancer that we have disproportionately here in South Carolina?
That's a great question. There are a number of cancers that we have in excess here, partly because of the demographics of our state. We have very high rates of esophageal cancer, the tube that...
And then you went to Emory. Talk about that. And you were the boy dean of Emory?
Well, I went to Emory in 1983. It was my first job, and I was on the faculty of the medical school initially, taking over running a big cancer research program. It was funded by the National Cancer Institute in Washington, and it was the mechanism by which we collect cancer statistics in this country. One of the centers in the country was in Atlanta, so we registered information on every cancer patient that was diagnosed in the city of Atlanta. That generated opportunities for doing all sorts of research. So a main focus of my initial career was cancer research, particularly looking at differences between African Americans and Caucasians with respect to risk of developing certain cancers and then the prognosis once they get the cancer. From there, I early on became...
Let me interrupt you. Just, how big is that disparity between African... Hi, I'm Phil Noble, and welcome to Envision South Carolina. We're here at the College of Charleston with Dr. Ray Greenberg from MUSC, sort of the personification of world-class, globally connected. So welcome to Envision.
Well, thank you, Phil. It's good to be here.
We usually start out talking about where people came from, their background. You unfortunately are from North Carolina, right?
It's a cross I have to bear, I guess,
I know.
from your perspective. Yeah, I grew up in Chapel Hill. My father was on the faculty at the University of North Carolina. So I grew up in that little island of liberalism in the midst of a very conservative state. But it was a very idyllic childhood, growing up almost on the campus of the University of North Carolina.
Were you interested in medicine from early on? How'd you get the bug, so to speak?
You know, it's interesting. I don't think I really got interested in medicine until I got to college. And I was a chemistry major, and virtually everybody that was taking classes with me was pre-med. And it was kind of like osmosis. Their interest generated my interest. I got into doing research early on as an undergraduate. And from there decided that medicine was a place with a tremendous amount of opportunity.
And you graduated from medical school in North Carolina?
I went across to the dark side, as they would say in Chapel Hill. I went to medical school at Duke, and I graduated from there, and then did a little tour of duty in the north at Harvard School of Public Health, and was at Children's Hospital in Boston, and then came back to Chapel Hill where I got a PhD.
Public health at Harvard's like the best public health school in the country, right, or the world?
Well, it's hard to know exactly how you rank schools, but Harvard, Johns Hopkins, University of North Carolina, University of Michigan, those are all top-tier schools. And of course, the one that we created at Emory now is amongst them. Connects our mouth to our stomach. Very high rates of cancer there, particularly among the African American population, and we don't really know why that is. There are probably dietary factors involved. There could be other environmental exposures that we just haven't figured out. We know that in general, people, historically, people who've gotten those kinds of cancers have been high rates of drinking and smoking, but that isn't necessarily true in the African American population. So we still have a lot of very fundamental issues to better understand when it comes to cancer risk.
From Emory to MUSC, right?
Right. So at Emory, I got into administrative work. I became a department chairman at the tender age of 32 in the School of Medicine. And then 3 years later, they decided to create a School of Public Health. And after a national search, I was selected to be the dean of that brand new school. And did that for 5 years. And then